All right, so you ready to dive in with this today?
Always.
Okay, good, because we've got a single video clip for you. And let me tell you, it's packed with some pretty intense claims.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, about FEMA funding New York City and how they're handling support for migrants.
Sounds like a hot topic for sure.
Yeah, it really is.
It is a lot to unpack there.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's fascinating how one little video can touch on so many kind of hot button issues all at once.
Right.
You've got government spending, you've got immigration policies, the role of federal agencies all swirling around in this one clip. So our mission today is to break it all down for you, examine the different viewpoints, and hopefully kind of shed some light on the bigger picture.
For sure, and it really jumps right into the action.
Okay.
Starting off with this almost shocking claim about $80 million in FEMA funds.
Okay.
That were originally earmarked for New York City to help with migrant services.
Okay.
But then suddenly plowed back, to use their words by Christine Noem.
Right.
Who was Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security?
So they don't shy away from using some strong language to describe this whole thing.
No.
Calling it highway robbery at one point.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it kind of sets the stage for the whole video, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Framing the narrative around this idea that the Trump administration is taking a firm stance against what they see as wasteful government spending, especially when it comes to immigrants.
You can definitely feel that outrage throughout the entire video.
Sure.
They present this as a clear example of government overreach and just misuse of taxpayer dollars.
And they're very critical of the Biden administration, too, right?
Yeah.
And their approach to immigration, suggesting that they're basically fueling this crisis and allowing taxpayer money to be wasted on people who, according to the video, shouldn't even be in the country.
But they do acknowledge that there are those who argue that this funding was legally allocated and desperately needed to support all these migrants arriving in New York.
Right, so you've got this clash of perspectives from the very beginning.
Right away.
Was it misuse of funds or essential support?
Yeah.
Really depends who you ask.
Totally. And that back and forth really gets to the heart of, I think, some fundamental disagreements about what FEMA is actually supposed to be doing, how taxpayer money should be spent, and even Congress's role in all of this.
Right. The video really leans into the argument that FEMA's primary responsibility is disaster relief for American citizens, and anything beyond that is essentially diverting resources away from those who need it most.
But of course, there's the counter-argument that Congress, which includes both Democrats and Republicans, voted to approve this funding specifically for migrant support.
Right. So then they go on to say that the Biden administration is basically disregarding an executive order from the Trump era designed to stop this type of spending.
Like a power struggle over these funds.
Yeah, you could say that. And they very deliberately set up this kind of us versus them dynamic, don't they?
Yeah, framing the Trump administration as the champions of the average American taxpayer.
Right.
Protecting them from what they see as reckless spending by the Democrats.
It's interesting how they use Chris Hayes, the MSNBC host, as an example.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they claim that he intentionally misrepresented the cost of housing migrants in hotels, saying it was only like $12.50 per night.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they use information from the Associated Press to kind of counter that claim, stating that the actual average cost is way more like $150 to $200 per night.
Yeah.
So you have the huge discrepancy in the numbers.
Right.
And they use it to raise questions about transparency and accountability.
So what are they suggesting is happening with this cost?
Well,
this difference in cost, are they saying that someone's pocketing the extra money?
Well, they present two possibilities.
Right.
Either New York City taxpayers are unknowingly footing the bill for this difference.
Okay.
Or FEMA is dipping into its disaster relief funds to cover the difference.
Interesting.
Which they argue would be completely inappropriate and possibly even illegal.
It's a pretty bold accusation.
It is.
And they bring up the reaction of the New York City comptroller, who apparently was furious when he discovered that this $80 million had been pulled back.
Yeah.
He even used that term highway robbery.
Oh, wow.
Mirroring the language from the video.
So it's a powerful moment that really highlights the intensity of the situation, right?
For sure.
And it feeds directly into one of the core arguments that the video is making.
Yeah.
Which is that the Trump administration was sending a very deliberate message by taking back these funds.
Like they were drawing a line in the sand.
Exactly.
Saying we're prioritizing American citizens and won't tolerate what they see as frivolous spending on immigrants.
Exactly. And to really drive that point home, they make this striking comparison.
Okay.
Saying that the $660 million allocated for migrant support is roughly equivalent to the lifetime earnings of 220 individuals.
Wow. It's a powerful image.
It is.
Makes you think about the scale of the spending involved.
Definitely.
And they end by basically saying that the Democrats are out of touch with common sense and will continue to face consequences for their actions.
It's a very provocative ending that definitely leaves the listener with a lot to ponder.
Yeah.
But before we jump to any conclusions,
Right.
it's important to remember that this video is presenting a very specific perspective.
Yeah.
Right? And there are other viewpoints out there that we need to consider as well.
Absolutely. And that's what we're here to do.
Yeah.
Unpack it all and try to help you make sense of it.
Exactly.
Now, before we move on, what are some of the things that stood out to you in this first part of the video?
Well, for me, it's the way they use language to evoke such strong emotions. You know, they're clearly trying to paint a particular picture, and they do it really effectively.
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of loaded language being used here.
Oh, yeah.
Words like illegal immigrants, wasteful spending, government overreach. It definitely creates a certain atmosphere.
For sure. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And examine how those word choices might be shaping our understanding of the situation.
That's a great point. It's all about being aware of the techniques that are being used to persuade us. Whether it's this video or any other source of information.
Exactly.
We got to be careful.
And I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground already, and it's important to give our listener a chance to digest it all.
Agreed. We've just scratched the surface here, and there's so much more to explore. But for now, let those ideas simmer a bit, and we'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into this fascinating and complex issue.
So we've seen how this video sets up its narrative using some pretty strong language and imagery to paint a certain picture of what's going on.
It definitely feels like they're trying to lead you to a specific conclusion.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to kind of step back for a second and think about, what assumptions are baked into this whole story? What biases might be at play?
Okay, so let's try to connect this to the bigger picture here. What's the context that we need to keep in mind?
Well, one thing that jumps out at me is how often they use the term the legal immigrants.
Yeah.
That phrase carries a lot of baggage with it, right?
Yeah, it does.
And can really influence how we view the situation.
It's interesting how a single word or a phrase can have such a big impact on how we perceive things.
Absolutely. And it's not just individual words either. It's the whole framing of the issue.
Right.
This video very clearly positions the Trump administration as the heroes fighting to protect American taxpayers. But is that the only way to look at it?
That's a good question. I mean, they do bring up those opposing arguments, but it always feels like they're just setting them up to be knocked down.
Exactly. They mention the argument that the funding was approved by Congress, but then they quickly dismiss it by saying that Trump wasn't obligated to spend money in ways that he thought were harmful. It's a clever tactic, but it doesn't really engage with the complexity of the issue, does it?
So what does all this mean for our listener? What can they take away from this deep dive so far?
I think the biggest takeaway here is to be aware of the persuasive techniques being used no matter where you're getting your information from.
Right.
Whether it's a video like this, a news article, or even just a conversation. It's so important to develop those critical thinking skills.
It's like you need a decoder ring to navigate the world of information these days.
Exactly. And this video is like a perfect example of how to start asking those critical questions. Who's telling the story? What are their motivations? Are there other perspectives that they might be leaving out?
Once you start asking those questions, you're on your way to becoming a much more informed and discerning consumer of information. You're not just taking things at face value anymore.
Exactly. Okay, so let's maybe zoom in on a specific example the video uses.
Okay.
That discrepancy in the cost of housing migrants in hotels.
Right. They make a big deal about Chris Hayes saying the cost is $12.50 per night. Well, the Associated Press reports a much higher number, like $150 to $200.
Right, and they present this as evidence that either the city is being dishonest about the true cost or that FEMA is illegally using disaster relief money to cover the difference.
They even bring up that anecdote about the New York City controller being furious when he found out about the missing $80 million.
Right.
Calling it highway robbery, just like the video does.
It's a very powerful story, but remember, we're only getting one side of it.
That's true. What are some other possible explanations for this cost difference?
Well, could there be a simple misunderstanding somewhere along the line, or are there legitimate reasons why the actual cost might be higher than that initial estimate that Chris Hayes gave?
It's a good reminder that there's often more to the story than what's presented on the surface.
Exactly, and it highlights why it's so important to get your information from multiple sources. Don't just rely on one video or one news article.
Right.
Do your own research, cross-check the facts, and try to get a well-rounded understanding of the situation.
Solid advice, and since we're talking about doing research, let's dig a little deeper into these claims about FEMA's mission and whether it's appropriate to use their funds for migrant support. What does the actual legislation say about this?
That's a great place to start. So what we need to understand is that FEMA's mission isn't limited to just responding to natural disasters.
So you're saying it's broader than that?
It's broader than that, yeah.
Okay, so helping migrants could actually fall under their responsibilities.
In certain situations, yes. And the legislation authorizing these funds is very specific about the criteria that need to be met.
Okay, so walk us through it. What are those criteria?
Essentially, the funds are meant to help cities and organizations that are providing basic necessities to migrants who have been released from federal custody.
Okay.
This could include things like temporary housing, food, medical care, legal help.
So it's not just about putting them up in luxury hotels like the video implies.
Right. It's about providing humanitarian aid while they navigate the legal process, which can be incredibly complicated and time-consuming.
That makes sense. But the video keeps suggesting that this is taking away from disaster relief efforts. Is there any truth to that?
Well, FEMA has a huge budget, right? And these funds for migrant support come from a specific allocation decided on by Congress. It's not like they're rated a disaster relief fund to pay for these services.
So it's not an either-or situation.
Exactly. The video tries to frame it that way, but the reality is much more nuanced. FEMA can and does handle multiple priorities at the same time.
Okay, so we've clarified that supporting migrants can be part of FEMA's job and that these funds aren't necessarily coming out of the disaster relief budget. But the video still raises concerns about the amount of money being spent and the potential for waste.
And that's a valid concern. Anytime you're dealing with taxpayer money, there needs to be transparency and accountability. It's crucial to have systems in place to make sure that the funds are being used responsibly and effectively.
So how do we balance providing necessary support with making sure the money is spent wisely?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it goes far beyond just this specific case. It gets to the heart of a much larger debate about the role of government, how we allocate resources, and how we prioritize competing needs.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but this deep dive has given our listener a lot to think about. We've unpacked the claims made in the video, examined the different perspectives, and explored the details of FEMA's mission and funding.
And hopefully this has sparked some critical thinking and encouraged our listener to dig deeper into this issue on their own, because at the end of the day, that's what the deep dive is all about.
I love that. And speaking of digging deeper, I think it's time we turn our attention to that dramatic comparison the video makes between the total funding for migrant support and the lifetime earnings of 220 individuals.
Yeah, that was a powerful image designed to really make you feel the weight of that $660 million figure.
But is it a fair comparison? Is there more to the story than that simple calculation? It really made you stop and think, didn't it? Like, wow, that's a lot of money. But I'm curious, is it really as simple as they make it sound?
Well, that's where we need to kind of dig into the specifics, right? How does FEMA's mandate actually work? How are these funds actually allocated? It's important to remember that FEMA's mission isn't just about, responding to natural disasters like hurricanes or earthquakes.
So you're saying it's broader than that?
Exactly. It also includes providing support during other types of emergencies, and that can include large-scale migrations.
Okay, so helping migrants could actually be part of their official duties.
Yes, in certain situations, yes. And that's where the legislation that authorized these funds comes in, right? It's not just like a blank check for any migrant-related expense. There are very specific criteria that have to be met.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. What are those criteria?
Well, the funds are meant to help cities and organizations that are providing essential services to migrants who have been released from federal custody, after crossing the border. This could include things like temporary shelter, food, medical care, legal assistance.
So it's not just about putting them up in, like, fancy hotels, as the video kind of implied.
Right. It's about, providing that basic humanitarian aid while they navigate the legal process, which can be, incredibly complex and time-consuming.
That makes sense. But the video still seems to be arguing that this is taking away from disaster relief efforts. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's important to remember that FEMA's budget is enormous, right? And these funds for migrant support come from a specific allocation, designated by Congress. It's not like they're raiding the disaster relief coffers to pay for these services.
So it's not a zero-sum game where if one program gets money, another program loses out.
Exactly. The video tries to create that, that either-or scenario, but the reality is that FEMA can and does handle multiple priorities simultaneously.
Okay, so we've clarified that, providing support to migrants can be part of FEMA's mandate and that these funds aren't necessarily coming from disaster relief. But the video still raises these concerns about the amount of money being spent and the possibility of waste or misuse.
And that's a valid concern. Anytime you're dealing with large amounts of, taxpayer money, there needs to be that transparency and accountability, right? We need to make sure those funds are being used appropriately and efficiently.
So how do we strike that balance between, like, providing the necessary support and ensuring that the money is being spent responsibly.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it goes beyond just this specific case. It taps into a much larger discussion about the role of government, resource allocation, how we prioritize competing needs in our society.
It's a big one with no easy answers.
It certainly is. But I think this deep dive has given you, our listener, a lot to think about. We've unpacked the claims in the video, explored different perspectives, dug into the intricacies of FEMA mission and funding.
And hopefully it's inspired you to maybe do a little more digging on your own.
Because that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Empowering you to be more informed and engaged citizens.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We've seen some starkly contrasting views on government spending, immigration, the role of federal agencies. What aspects of this situation resonate most with you? What further questions does this raise about how resources are allocated and priorities are determined? Think on that until we meet again for another intriguing exploration here on The Deep Dive.